Hello everyone. Brexit has been in the news for many years now, and I know that many people get confused as to the what, why and how of the whole process. So I thought it might be worthwhile having a look at that. I might start off by saying that it all started about 8,000 years ago, when Britain actually became an island because of rising sea levels. Before then, it had been attached to the European mainland. Now, that's only a joke really. We don't need to go as far back as all that. But it is important to point out that Britain indeed is an island. And being an island nation, its people have an island mentality. And that island mentality is one of thinking in terms of isolation, really. Now, we should definitely go back to the time of the British Empire, because that meant that Britain had territories all around the world, and that, as a consequence, its relationships with mainland Europe were not seen as all that important. Combine the two, that island mentality, and then the fact under the British Empire that relationships with Europe were not all that important, and you get a very strong basis for what eventually turned into Brexit. Britain only joined the European community, as it was then, in 1973. And at that time, it was only really interested in the economic aspect of that EC. And as soon as the EC began to develop into a more social and political union, began to develop into the EU as it is now, the relationship between the UK and the EU took a wrong turn. Now, it's usually the technical political angle that most people get confused with. And I will try to explain that using a PowerPoint.
Let's have a look at the way in which Brexit has developed. In 2015, the Prime Minister David Cameron began to feel political pressure from the right in the shape of UKIP, which scored heavily in the European elections, pressure to harden Britain's stance towards the EU. He promised to hold a referendum on EU membership. A very dirty campaign started on both the Leave side, with UKIP leader Nigel Farage and Conservative heavyweight Boris Johnson as the main proponents, and the Remain side, with, among others, David Cameron. One of the memorable images of the campaign was the red Leave bus, promising £350 million a week for the NHS. Absolute lies were bandied about freely on both sides, and scaremongering was the order of the day. On the day of the referendum, the 23rd of June 2016, Britain unexpectedly voted to leave the EU, 52% against 48%. There were, however, huge differences regionally and demographically. Scotland, for instance, decidedly voted to remain in the EU, as did Northern Ireland. And younger people overwhelmingly expressed their desire to remain too. From that moment onwards, Britain was a sharply divided society. There were immediate political results, the most important one being the resignation of David Cameron as PM. He just stepped aside to be succeeded as Conservative leader, after quite a strange election, by Theresa May, who then became the new Prime Minister. Almost immediately, a legal battle began between the government and Parliament, with the government wanting to decide things to do with the whole Brexit process on its own, whereas Parliament wanted to have the final say in everything. This legal battle revealed straight away how difficult the whole process would be. There was widespread criticism on the government when it became clear that it had simply not considered that the outcome of the referendum could be a vote to leave. It was abundantly obvious that no plans whatsoever had been made to deal with that possibility. Both the House of Commons and the House of Lords started delaying tactics to slow down the whole process, as there was, across party lines, a clear majority against Britain leaving the EU in Parliament. The legal challenge did get the result they wanted. The High Court ruled that Parliament must have the last word on Brexit. Eventually, the first step in the formal process of exiting the EU was taken in March 2017, when Article 50 was triggered. This Article 50 is an element in EU law that makes it possible for an EU member state to formally request to leave the EU. Meanwhile, the division around Brexit remained significant, with Scotland strongly protesting and speculating about a second independence referendum so it would be able to remain in the EU. The divisions in Parliament went straight across party lines. Generally, the main criticism aimed at the government, namely that there was no strategy, no vision at all, continued unabated, as can be seen in this cartoon, depicting the Brexit Secretary David Davis claiming that there's no problem at all, reclining on a unicorn, an imaginary beast, with pigs flying all around him. One of the most hotly debated issues at this time was the question of whether a hard or a soft Brexit was the best solution. Within the main parties, there were hard and soft factions, also within the ruling Conservative Party. A hard Brexit stood for a complete break with the EU, whereas a soft Brexit would leave the UK with strong links with the EU. Prime Minister Theresa May's position increasingly came under pressure, so much so that she decided to call a snap election for June 2017, hoping to increase the Conservative majority. The outcome, however, was that the majority was lost, and that there was a so-called hung parliament, with no single party having a majority. May was forced into a deal with the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, a fairly extremist Northern Irish party, which, in return for £1 billion subsidy to Northern Ireland, was prepared to tacitly support a minority Conservative government. The result? A continued lack of progress. So, what were the main problems in the Brexit negotiations? First, there was the so-called divorce payment, a financial settlement of the costs of all the obligations that the UK had undertaken as a member of the EU. Secondly, there were the rights of EU citizens in the UK and vice versa. And thirdly, there was the biggest problem regarding the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, which would become an outside EU border. However, that border, or namely the fact that it would be almost non-existent, had been an important part of the peace settlement after the Northern Irish Troubles. Making it a real border again would almost inevitably lead to renewed violence in Northern Ireland. Because of the lack of progress, May's cabinet was slowly falling apart, with several ministers resigning. The end of the negotiation period, namely March 2019, was drawing ever closer, and as no deal was even within sight, the deadline was postponed a few times. The final sticking point remained the Irish border, and the question whether it would become a hard or a soft border. A soft or invisible border would avoid a rekindling of the Northern Irish troubles, but it would mean that there would effectively be a hard border within the UK, namely between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. To avoid that problem, the so-called backstop plan was worked out, meaning that Northern Ireland would effectively remain in the single market until an alternative plan could be worked out between the EU and the UK. It actually meant that the UK would be forced to retain a common customs policy with the EU until another solution for the Irish border was found. It was, among others, this backstop plan that allowed a deal to be reached between Prime Minister May and the EU in November 2018. It was, however, not received well in the UK, to say the least, putting the PM's position even more under threat. And though the deal was approved by the EU, May tried and failed 3 times to get the deal approved in the UK Parliament. A new deadline, namely the 31st of October 2019, was agreed on. The unavoidable challenge to May's leadership of the Tory party, the Conservative Party, followed, and Boris Johnson was elected the new leader and as such became the new Prime Minister. Boris Johnson had long been a proponent of a so-called hard Brexit, and he immediately promised a definitive Brexit on the 31st of October 2019, no ifs or buts. He then proceeded to announce an exceptionally long prorogation, a kind of suspension of Parliament, from the beginning of September, effectively silencing Parliament in the run-up to the Brexit deadline. Parliament immediately challenged this prorogation in the Supreme Court. The House of Commons also pushed through a law forbidding a no-deal Brexit and forcing the Prime Minister to ask the EU for a further postponement if no deal was reached by the current deadline. Johnson also lost a vote proposing early elections. The Supreme Court eventually ruled the long prorogation unlawful. Johnson was forced to ask the EU for a further extension, and the EU agreed to a so-called flextension until the end of January 2020. Parliament then agreed to hold a general election on the 12th of December 2019, which turned into a landslide victory for the Conservative Party. Johnson formed a new government, and on the 31st of January 2020, the UK formally left the EU. That was the start of the transition period of 1 year, during which a new trade deal should be negotiated between the UK and the EU. Those negotiations effectively began in March 2020, but were immediately pushed into the background by the worldwide corona crisis. Now, at the end of July 2020, we're still very far from any agreement, and plenty of warnings are being heard that a no-deal Brexit is very much on the cards again. This whole Brexit saga is definitely not over yet.